Hey everyone, hope you're doing well and that you're enjoying some of your free time. Um, so I know that your IA is coming due here in a couple of days. And so I wanted to just go through a couple of different um, tips and strategies and to give you an idea of some of the things that you should be aiming for on your Section 2 for your rough draft. So as you are probably aware, I have been writing an IA with you. I decided to change the topic to something that was a little bit more, something that we were going to cover in class. Um, and so what I want to do is go through part of that with you. I've only got about 15 minutes with this because it's the only free software available for this, I think. But anyway, so I'm not finished with my section 2, but I have my introduction and I have a completed paragraph. Really, it's one of my three perspectives that I want to pick for this question. So the question that I am going with is, to what extent were the consequences of the Great Leap Forward primarily economic? We are going to be covering this topic next year when you guys are seniors. Super duper like 20-second overview. The Great Leap Forward was an economic plan put forward by the dictator of China, Mao Zedong, and it had some pretty disastrous consequences. There were about 45 million people who died of starvation over a period of 4 years from 1958 to 1962. So the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make sure that you have some examples of what your IA should look like and how it should be structured. So I am just going to quickly go through the criteria for section 2. I'm not going to look at any of the other ones other than 13 to 15, which is this is the 13 to 15 points out of 15. And to get that, you want to make sure that your investigation is clear, coherent, and effectively organized. What that means is in your introduction, you should have like just a couple of sentences. I know I had said before it should be about 5, but ideally it really should just be a couple. You really only need probably 2 sentences of really important context, since IB really just assumes that you have a passing understanding of your subject and you don't need to prove that to them. So what is important enough that you think people have to know or they're not going to understand? So in your introduction, you should have a bare minimum, but preferably 3 perspectives on your topic. And so the Great Leap Forward had some pretty devastating consequences. I'm choosing to focus today because that's what I finished on the economic consequences, but I've also listed that there are 2 other perspectives, not just economic. So I'm covering in this IA, and I note that here, some historians argue that the results proved disastrous for the Chinese economy. I list a historian who is going to be one of my main sources for section 1, discusses the consequences of subsequent economic development. I also argue a second perspective, Frank de Coter, who's a Dutch historian on communist history, focusing on the demographic impact. So that's the loss of life. The economic impact is agricultural, industrial production, the waste of resources, government wasting money, that kind of stuff. Whereas demographic is people who died, so 45 million people who starved to death. This would also count as, for instance, there was a father who had to bury his son alive because he stole grain from the state in 1959. And then the third perspective is the environmental devastation. So there was mass widespread deforestation, soil erosion, soil degradation, increased CO2 production because of all the coal factories that were fired up, lots of engineering problems that led to things like droughts and famines. And so these are 3 key perspectives that I'm going to discuss in my IA. Let me check the time that I have here. I guess it's not going to show me. Okay, anyway, so what we're going to do is take a look then at my first proposal, at my first perspective, and that is on the economic costs. So when it comes to economic costs, right, or at least my first perspective, I am going to label evidence in this section, and you can't see it because you're only looking at my computer screen, but on my desk I have all of my sources arranged into their respective categories. So I have all of my evidence compiled together that I'm using for my economic perspective. Then I have one specifically for the demographics, and then all of my evidence for the environmental costs. And so importantly, I'm only including evidence in this perspective on economics, right, on the economic side of things, that backs up that perspective. So let's read through this together really quickly. So many historians view economic impacts as a key consequence of the Great Leap Forward. It's sort of an introductory sentence. I'm stating that this is one perspective. Note that in my introduction, I'm also using that time to distinguish the different historical perspectives. You want to make sure that you do that. The production of steel, coal, and cement needed to industrialize saw initial success, more than doubling 1958 output levels. But by the end of the GLF, that's the Great Leap Forward, in 1962, compared with 1958 levels, production of steel had fallen by 25%, coal by 19%, and cement by 36%. So notice that so far, I haven't actually directly quoted anything because these are government statistics. Similarly, in agricultural, total grain production from 57 to 58 increased by 8%, but by 61, total grain output had fallen to 80% of 57 output levels. So what you should be doing in your piece is you should be paraphrasing as much as possible. This has two benefits for you. Benefit number one is most of what you've probably learned, and probably some of the stuff you're putting in, most of the stuff you're putting in your paper isn't stuff you already knew before. One of the things you have to be able to show to get a good grade on section 2 is you have to provide evidence from a range of sources used effectively to support the argument. This is why I said you should have like 9 to 10 sources minimum. And so the more that you can cite sources and the more that you can paraphrase, that's going to be a benefit for you because you're getting closer to that range of sources because you're citing things more. The other benefit it has is by paraphrasing, you are showing that you are more advanced. You are showing that not only can you cherry pick evidence, but you can also show the ability that you are analyzing, you're assessing the evidence, right? And so that's one of the other benefits that it has. So the vast, vast, vast majority of the stuff that you talk about, that you write in your section 2, should be paraphrased. Now, it may look scary, right? We're going to ignore the first 4 citations because they're in a different paragraph. But in this paragraph alone, I have a grand total of 14 citations. Now, like I said, that's not meant to scare you, okay? But the idea is the vast majority of what you should be writing isn't really your own thoughts. Think of it this way. The more that you're relying on what your authors have to say, the less you have to come up with. Right? This isn't like a persuasive essay where you have to come up with your own thoughts all the time. This is largely going to just save you time. What do the authors think? And then really you're just kind of adding your own thoughts in there occasionally, right? So continuing, right? So we have all these government statistics. This is where my own thoughts come in. This is where you are hitting the evaluation of different perspectives and well-developed critical analysis. So let's go back here. However, after I've just looked at this evidence, however, it should be noted that these are official statistics from the Chinese government and should be viewed with skepticism. Now, I could have basically stopped there, or actually, I could have said what I'm about to say on my own because it's fairly easy to make that argument. But again, by doing what I'm about to do, I'm adding an additional citation and an extra source without having to do really any work. Historian Tony Syke correctly points out, so I'm evaluating evidence in that statement, quote, most communes and industrial units falsified production to show that they were more red, that's more devoted, than their neighbors, end quote. More of my own thoughts. Given the lack of transparency from the Chinese Communist Party, these numbers could be far worse than official statistics show. See, this is a good way to evaluate evidence. This is me questioning evidence and assumptions, right? And I'm actually saying, though, in this, that the numbers of how bad the Chinese economy was actually is probably going to be much worse, right? So it's a good way for you to get in and say, okay, what's going on here? How can I add to this? How can I analyze more effectively? More than economic output levels, Professor Kong Chao argues that the quality of industrial goods was poor. This again is paraphrased of something that he said. Since there were widespread shortages of raw materials, producers were forced to use, quote, inferior materials, poor substitutes for scrap metals, which, and then me kind of paraphrasing again, which lowered the quality of the finished product. The quality was often so poor on one occasion when Mao sold a helicopter to Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, quote, the manufacturers were so scared it might crash that they detained it at the border. Leaky batteries sold to Iraq, defective shoes sold to the Soviet Union, and hundreds of other inferior goods produced during the Great Leap Forward. And that's paraphrased. And then this is me giving just a super quick thought of my own, right? That's helping me to evaluate that evidence. This gave China a reputation as a poor trading partner. Professor Kent Deng's research, another source that I have, also shows that as a result of the Great Leap Forward, capital return on investment had fallen by 30% and labor productivity by 38%, paraphrased statistics. There were also concerns about the waste of capital and natural resources. In Hunan province, 2.2 tons of iron were used to produce just 1 ton of steel. That's paraphrased. And in Beijing, the government spent some 12 billion yuan producing goods that were only worth 7.2 billion yuan. Also paraphrased. Right? So if you notice, as I'm going through this, there's very little that I myself am actually saying. And that's the point of section 2. It should largely be what your sources are saying. And your thoughts, really the only place where your thoughts come in are where you are assessing the evidence as appropriate. Because note, I could basically offer my thoughts on every single piece of evidence, but that's not really a smart way to do it, right? So pick and choose your battles. Chao also argues that given the government's obsession with raw output, thousands of vehicles were unable to be kept operational due to a shortage of spare parts and repair mechanics who had all been converted to production lines. Again, that was me reading my source and paraphrasing because that's really grown up, right? That's going to get you a lot more points the more you paraphrase instead of use direct quotations. Strong Soviet criticisms of the Great Leap Forward led to Nikita Khrushchev's cancellation of aid and the recall of 1,400 technicians, as well as shipments of already scarce spare parts. It is therefore a fair assessment. So again, this is me coming in with my analysis and evaluation. It is therefore a fair assessment when Chao argues the Great Leap Forward knocked the Chinese economy completely off course, adding these economic shocks, quote, lasted for a considerable period after the movement was discontinued. So there's a few things to note in here, right? I'm not necessarily saying that you have to have 18 citations per paragraph, but the general rule is the more citations, the better. The more citations, the better. If you are struggling to come up with content, right, just understand that your question isn't and shouldn't be a yes/no, right? It shouldn't be yes, it was economic, no, it wasn't economic. Your perspectives should be your main point that you were going to make, and then what are some other plausible theories it could be, even if it's not directly related, as long as it has something to do, right? So economic is one of them. Demographic, right? The loss of life, that's not really economic, but that is that still a consequence of the Great Leap Forward? Absolutely, it was, right? So be able to organize your thoughts, even if they're not related to each other, if they're related to your main point, which for me is talking about the consequences of the Great Leap Forward, then go for it, right? And when you are going through each of your perspectives, organize your evidence in a way that makes sense, right? So you're not telling a story. Notice, if you read this paragraph, and I'll put this up on Google Classroom, if you read this paragraph, I'm not telling a story. I've actually broken down the economic perspective into 3 separate perspectives. Take a look, right? So I have government statistics of overall production numbers. That's where this starts out with, right? That's this, okay? The second part that is broken down is actually talking about the quality of the goods, right? Because that was another side effect of economic consequences, is the goods that were produced were garbage, right? And so shortage of raw materials, inferior, right? Not even their own Vietnamese allies would buy their helicopters because they had like a 50% chance they were going to crash at any time, right? So again, more defective products, right? So giving China a poor reputation as a trading partner. And then talking about government waste, right? So a waste of resources, shortages of goods and services, right? So they're all being broken down into different categories. That's also a good way to avoid narration, which would get you marked down on the IA because you're not, again, you're not trying to tell